Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I rise to address the issue of the sequestration and the Democrat and Republican alternatives, but I want to start by expressing just how disappointed I am that we're having the debate in this fashion. This is certainly among the very most important issues that we are grappling with, should be grappling with as a Senate, as Congress, as a federal government. Getting ourselves on a sustainable fiscal path is as important as anything we could be doing. The sequestration is an important part of that. And unfortunately, the majority party here doesn't want to have a full and open debate and won't permit multiple amendments from both sides. Now, I don't know how many ideas there are on the Democratic side. I know there's at least 3 or 4 or 5 different ideas on the Republican side. And frankly, I think any sensible approach to this ought to have a full and open, robust debate, and I'm happy to vote on every one of them. I'd vote against some. I'll probably vote for others. But why in the world would we say there can only be 2 choices? One Democrat choice and one Republican choice. I have to say I am extremely disappointed that we have gotten to this point where we cannot have an open debate and amendments on a wide range of ideas because the challenges require that kind of response. And it's very disappointing that the majority party refuses to conduct that debate and appears unwilling to have those votes. Nevertheless, I have developed a bill together with Senator Inhofe, which I think is a much more sensible way to achieve the savings that we badly need. And I will say unequivocally, we need to trim spending. We cannot continue spending at the rate that we've been spending money. We can't continue trillion-dollar deficits. We have a $16 trillion debt. The massive deficits and the accumulated debt are today costing us jobs and holding back our economy. So we need to begin the process of getting spending under control, and frankly, the sequester barely starts that process. The president's been campaigning around the country spreading this idea that somehow we're going to have a complete economic disaster and meltdown if this modest spending discipline goes ahead. We keep hearing about austerity. The question is, what austerity? Let me put a little context into what we're talking about here. First of all, over the last 12 years, the federal government has doubled in size. We spend 100% more now than we did a dozen years ago. And after this huge run-up in the size of federal spending, this sequester, if it goes into effect or its equivalent, would reduce spending by 2.3%. After growing by 100%, really, we can't find 2.3%? Oh, and by the way, that's budget authority, which means permission to spend. The actual amount that would be spent in this year would go down by about 1.2%. That's less than half of 1% of our economy. Here's the other thing. This is how much austerity we're talking about. If the savings of the sequester go into effect, total spending by the government in 2013 will be greater than spending was in 2012. So let's just be clear about what's going on here. This is not nearly the amount of savings that we need. This is merely one step in the right direction. And while government has been growing, the economy is not. We've had all this spending growth. We've had massive deficits. And what have we gotten in return? The worst economic recovery from any recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment that's persistently unacceptably high, around 8%, the official measure, but when you take into account the people who've left the workforce altogether and who've given up looking for work, it's much, much higher than that. The fact is, economic growth doesn't depend on a bloated government that's always growing. In fact, we'll have stronger economic growth as soon as we begin to demonstrate that we can get on a sustainable fiscal path. As soon as we can start to take the threat of a fiscal collapse off the table by showing we can get spending under control. So it's absolutely essential, for the sake of our economy and job growth, that we achieve the savings of this sequester. But I am the first to acknowledge there are a couple of problems with the way that this legislation goes about it. And that's the reason that I've introduced this legislation along with Senator Inhofe. The 2 big problems are, one, the savings hits our defense budget disproportionately. The defense budget's about 18% of total spending, but it's half of this whole sequester, and that's after we've already cut defense spending. So I'm very sympathetic to the concern that this imposes a real problem on our defense budget. And the second problem is that the cuts are not very thoughtfully designed. There's no discretion, there's no flexibility. Those categories that are subject to the sequestration, those categories of spending are cut across the board. Now, there are huge categories that are not subject, like the entire Social Security program and many others are not affected at all. But for those programs that are, there's no ability to be discerning in which programs ought to be cut more, which ones ought to be cut less, which ones perhaps should not be cut at all. And so the bill that I've introduced and that we'll be voting on today, at least a cloture motion, together with Senator Inhofe, addresses both of these problems. It does require that we achieve the savings of the sequester, because that's very, very important. But it would allow the president flexibility in how it's achieved, so that we don't have these very ham-handed, poorly designed across-the-board cuts. What the president would be able to do if this bill passes, he could go to his service chiefs on the defense side, he could go to his agency and department heads on the non-defense side and say, okay, look, you've been used to budgets that just keep growing and growing. That's what's been happening. And this year, you're going to have to cut back a little bit, a few pennies of every dollar. So look for the programs that are working least well or not at all. Look for areas where there's waste and inefficiency. Look for redundancies. And that's where we're going to trim a little bit. And we'll hit these goals. That's what any competent manager in any business would do. That's what families have to do. That's what state and local governments have to do. That's what we need to do here. And that's what this bill would enable the president to do, to find the areas where we can make the cuts without causing great disruption. Now, this is not a blank check for the president. There are constraints on what the president could do under the legislation that Senator Inhofe and I are proposing here. For instance, there could be no tax hike. We don't think we need still more tax increases after all the ones we've recently been through. The defense cuts could not be any greater than what's contemplated in the current sequestration. Under Senator Inhofe's approach and mine, they could be less. The president could choose to follow the advice of his senior military advisors and cut the defense budget a little bit less and shift this to elsewhere. I'm one that believes that the Defense Department, our defense budget, should not be exempt from scrutiny and from spending discipline and some cuts, but I think they ought to be done carefully and thoughtfully. The president would not be able to increase any amounts. This isn't an exercise in just shifting money to another account. It's a question of where can we do the cuts most thoughtfully and sensibly. Any cuts in the defense budget would have to be consistent with the National Defense Authorization Act that's been passed. The president would have to achieve 100% of the savings. That's part of this. And he couldn't use any gimmicks to do it. No phony cuts in the future offset by promises for cuts in another time. None of that. It'd have to be straightforward, have to be honest. And then finally, I think there's an important part. Congress would have a final say. When the president, under this approach, if it passed and were signed into law, the president would be required to propose an alternative series of cuts. And then Congress could vote to disapprove them if Congress chose to do that. So ultimately, Congress would still control that important element of the purse strings, but we would allow the president to find the most sensible way to do this. Now, the president's saying that he doesn't want this flexibility. And this is kind of unbelievable to me. He's going around the country, scaring the American people, threatening all kinds of disastrous things that he says he will have to do, and then he says in virtually the same breath, oh, and by the way, don't give me the flexibility to do something else. I don't understand that. It seems to me the obvious thing to do is to do these cuts in the way that won't be disruptive and won't do harm. Let me give one particular example. A good example is the FAA. If the sequester goes into effect on the FAA, the budget there will be cut by $670 million. That's from a total of just about $17 billion. Now, the President and the Transportation Secretary have said that if the sequester goes into effect, they're going to have to lay off air traffic controllers, might have to shut down control towers. We're going to have long delays at airports, flights canceled, all kinds of problems. Well, it's interesting to note, though, that if the sequester goes into effect, the amount of funding available to the FAA will still be more than what the president asked for in his budget. Now, in his budget request, was the president planning on laying off air traffic controllers and shutting down airports and air control towers? I rather doubt it. So, if we gave the president the flexibility just within the FAA budget, the president could adopt the kinds of savings that he proposed in his own budget and have enough money to pay all the air traffic controllers and keep the airports running. The point is, even within the FAA's budget, there would be no service disruptions whatsoever. They're not necessary. But our bill would give the president even more flexibility than that. He'd be able to achieve savings in other areas. He wouldn't have to, in other words, hit a particular savings number for the FAA. He might find savings in other places. Let me suggest that we have an unbelievably lengthy list of opportunities to reduce wasteful government spending and excessive spending. Instead of closing down air traffic control facilities or military bases or FBI offices, maybe what the president could do is cut back on federal employee travel. We spend $8 billion a year for federal employees to go on conferences and trips. Maybe we could cut back on the cell phone subsidies, where we buy cell phones for people, costing $1.5 billion a year. We spend millions of dollars on an old-fashioned style trolley in St. Louis, millions on a sports diplomacy exchange program. We have 14,000 vacant and underutilized properties. We spend money for a cowboy poetry festival and $1 million for taste testing foods to be served on Mars. I don't know about you, but I think that some of these are a little less important than keeping our air control system intact and safe. And it seems like common sense to me that we ought to give the president the discretion to reduce the spending on the less vital things and continue to fund the important things. But we don't have to only go after wasteful spending. We have an unbelievable number of redundancies and duplicate programs. Just a few examples. We have 80 different economic development programs spread across the federal government. We have 94 different programs to encourage the construction of green buildings. We have 47 different job training programs. Now, doesn't it make sense that if we're going to have some savings, we look to those programs that aren't working so well? It can't be that every program is equal. I guarantee you some of them are not working so well. I would like to think that the administration has metrics for performance, and it knows which ones are performing better and which ones are not. And we could concentrate the cuts on those that aren't working. Or we could decide to consolidate this huge plethora of programs and save a lot of money in overhead and administrative and bureaucracy costs. There's just any number of ways to achieve savings. Senator Tom Coburn has made an enormous contribution to our federal government by providing exhaustive litanies of duplication and redundancies and waste and excesses. That would be a very useful place to begin in terms of finding alternatives, in addition to the many that I've mentioned. So I would simply say, Madam President, we've got a simple choice here. This sequester is going into effect. Nobody here suggests that they have the votes or they have a way to prevent it. So the question is, are we going to achieve these savings through badly designed spending cuts that make no attempt whatsoever to distinguish between more sensible government spending and less sensible government spending? Or will we adopt this bill that Senator Inhofe and I have introduced, which will give the president the flexibility to cut where the cuts won't be painful, where there's waste, where there are excesses? We're talking about what will amount in actual outlays a little over 1% of the total government spending. This is a government that's doubled in size in the last 12 years. The people in Pennsylvania that I represent don't believe that every dollar of government spending is spent wisely and prudently and is necessary. They know that there's a lot of waste. So this is all about these next 6 months as we know the $1.2 trillion in savings in subsequent years are achieved by statutory spending caps, and in those years, the savings will be figured out by the Appropriations Committee, which is where this should be happening. I wish we had taken up an appropriation bill this last year, but we didn't. At least, given the reality that we face, we have an opportunity to avoid the kind of calamity and disaster that is being threatened and is completely unnecessary. So, Madam President, I hope we'll do the common sense thing, adopt a bill that will give the President the flexibility that he needs to make these cuts in a rational and sensible fashion. We need to achieve the savings for the sake of economic growth and job creation. This is no time to trade higher taxes for more spending, as my Democratic colleagues would prefer. This is a time to make sensible cuts in spending. We can do that, and I urge adoption of the measure that Senator Inhofe and I have proposed, and I yield back the floor.
Madam President.